Billionaire's sick daughter was dying, but what the maid did made the billionaire break down in tears. Stay with me till the very end and let me know where you're watching from so I can see how far the truth really spreads. The night began with chaos. 7-year-old Sophia Carter had been running through the yard when she tripped and fell hard on the pavement. Michael carried her into the emergency room, expecting nothing worse than a broken wrist or a sprained ankle. He stayed calm at first, telling her they would fix it quickly and be home by morning. The doctors ordered X-rays to check for fractures, but when the images came back, their faces shifted. They found something unusual in the bone tissue that did not look like a simple injury. To be certain, they requested more scans, blood work, and finally a biopsy. Michael's chest tightened as the hours dragged on, each test pulling him deeper into a fear he could not name. Days later, the final results came. It was not the fall that caused her pain. The accident had only revealed the truth hiding inside her body. Sophia had a rare and aggressive cancer, already spreading quietly through her bones and blood. The words hit Michael like a storm. He sat frozen in the chair, shaking his head as if denial could make it untrue. He had spent his life building wealth and power, sealing deals that moved industries, yet none of it mattered here. His little girl, who had laughed only hours before, was now facing an illness that medicine could barely fight. Treatments were mentioned, chemotherapy, trials, new drugs, but the doctors' voices carried the weight of doubt. They warned him gently that her chances were small, that time was short. Michael walked out of the hospital that night with his world shattered. The city lights blinked as if nothing had changed, but for him, everything had collapsed. He gripped Sophia's small hand, promising silently he would not let her go. Yet, in his heart, a desperate question rose. Could love itself reach beyond the limits of medicine and give his daughter the chance to live? Michael had carried loss, long before the doctors ever spoke the word cancer. 7 years earlier, he had stood in the same hospital, holding a newborn in his arms, while mourning the wife he had just lost in childbirth. From that moment, Sophia became his entire reason to keep breathing. He built his fortune higher, worked harder, and filled every empty space in his home with her laughter, so the silence of grief would not swallow him. Sophia grew up asking about the woman in the framed photograph on the mantel. She would point at the picture of a smiling woman with a round belly and ask who she was. Michael always softened his voice, telling her that was her mother, gentle and kind, who had given her life. Sophia would listen with wide eyes, sometimes whispering that she wished she could hug her just once. Those words pierced him every time, but he smiled, hiding the ache. Now the illness was stealing strength from her small body. She tired easily, her skin pale, her steps slower. Nights were filled with fevers and mornings with weakness. But her spirit held on with surprising light. She still teased her father, still asked to hear bedtime stories, and still looked at that photo of her mother as if searching for comfort. Michael tried to be strong in front of her, but in private he broke down, blaming fate for taking both his wife and soon his daughter. One evening, as he sat by her bed, Sophia whispered something that left him speechless. She said she had never had a real birthday party, not one with balloons and cake, music and friends. She wanted to wear a pretty dress, dance for a while, and feel normal. It was such a simple wish, yet for Michael it felt heavier than any deal he had ever signed. He nodded quickly, promising she would have it. His voice trembled, but his words were firm. He told her it would be the best birthday anyone had ever seen. That night he started making calls, reaching out to friends, nurses, and teachers. If there was only one memory left to give her, he would make sure it was filled with joy, not pain. And though fear pressed on his chest, he clung to the thought that love could still create light in the middle of the darkest season of their lives. Grace Miller had entered the Carter household as a young housekeeper when Sophia was still a baby. At first her role was simple, cleaning rooms and preparing meals. But life has a way of changing quiet jobs into something far deeper. She was the one who rocked Sophia to sleep when Michael was called away to late meetings. She was the one who warmed bottles, brushed out tangles in tiny curls, and stayed up through the nights when fever kept the child awake. Over time, those small acts of care built a bond that no title could capture. Sophia never thought of Grace as just someone who worked in the house. One morning, with no warning, she looked up and called her Mommy Number 2. The words came from innocence, but they carried a truth that everyone felt. Grace never corrected her, because deep down it was who she had become. Behind Grace's gentle smile lived a memory she rarely spoke of. Years earlier, she had a little sister who grew sick, and their family was too poor to afford treatment. Grace had held that small hand until it went cold, and the grief left a scar that never healed. She carried a silent promise inside her that if she ever had another chance to protect a child from the same fate, she would give everything. Sophia became the answer to that promise. Michael noticed the connection but never tried to interfere. He had lost his wife and spent years buried in business, unable to be present every moment. Grace filled the spaces he could not reach. She made Sophia laugh on gloomy days. She sat through endless hospital visits, holding the little girl's hand when doctors brought needles. When Sophia was scared, she did not call for her father or a nurse. She called for Grace. Every drawing Sophia made had two women. One was the mother she had never met, and the other was Grace standing right beside her. To Sophia, family was not about blood. It was about who stayed when the nights were long, who kissed her forehead, and who never let go. Grace became that anchor. She was not just a helper, she was love made visible. As the illness grew worse, Grace's devotion only deepened. She wiped tears, sang lullabies, and whispered stories of courage to keep the fear away. Her heart carried both the sorrow of the sister she lost and the determination never to lose this child. She knew she could not replace Sophia's mother, but she could give her the one thing every child deserves. A love so steady that even sickness could not erase it. The hospital room had been transformed, with balloons taped to the walls and a small cake glowing in the corner. Sophia sat in her wheelchair, wearing a pale pink dress that hung loosely on her thin frame. Her classmates gathered around, singing in cheerful voices that tried to pretend everything was normal. For a moment, it almost felt like it was. Grace stayed close, cutting slices of cake, wiping frosting from Sophia's chin, making sure she could keep up with the other children. Michael stood by the door, watching with pride and sorrow mixed in his eyes. He wanted this day to feel like a celebration, not a countdown. For Sophia, every smile from her friends was precious, every clap of hands a spark of life she had longed for. As the party slowed, the music faded to a soft hum. Sophia leaned against Grace, her head resting lightly on her shoulder. The chatter of children melted into the background, and in a quiet voice she asked the question that froze the room. She whispered, "Mommy, am I going to live?" Grace felt her heart stop. The cake in her hand trembled, and for a second she could not breathe. She looked into Sophia's eyes, wide and searching, holding more wisdom than any child should carry. It was not an innocent question. It was the truth spoken aloud, the truth everyone else had been too afraid to face. Tears burned behind Grace's eyes, but she held them back. She wanted to say yes, to give the answer every child deserves, but her lips refused to lie. Instead, she squeezed Sophia's hand and whispered, "You are strong, and I am here with you." It was all she could offer, honesty wrapped in love. Michael turned his face away, hiding his breaking heart. The nurses stood silent, and even the children seemed to sense the weight of the words. The balloons swayed gently as if the whole room was holding its breath. In that single moment, everything changed. It was no longer about pretending. It was about the fight ahead, and Grace knew in her soul she would not let this child face it alone. That night after the party, Grace lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Sophia's question echoed in her mind, a whisper she could not silence. "Mommy, am I going to live?" The words cut deeper than any knife. Grace knew she could not sit still and watch the child fade away. She made a decision that night. If medicine could not save Sophia, she would find another way. She opened her laptop and searched through medical journals, hospital websites, and stories of families who had faced the same fight. The hours slipped by, her eyes burning, her heart racing with every new page. Then she found it. A possibility. In rare cases, part of a liver from a living donor could be transplanted into a sick child. It was dangerous, complex, and often limited to blood relatives, but it was a chance. For Grace, even the smallest chance was enough. The next morning, she made her way to a clinic without telling anyone. Her hands shook as she filled out the forms, not as a mother, not as family, but simply as someone who loved the girl. The nurse raised an eyebrow when Grace explained, but the test was taken. She waited days that felt like years. Then the envelope came. Perfect match. Her blood, her enzymes, every marker, aligned as if fate itself had written the result. Grace pressed the paper to her chest, tears running freely. She whispered that her little girl finally had hope. But the hospital crushed it almost as quickly as it appeared. When she presented the results, the doctors shook their heads. Rules were rules. No legal or blood connection meant no approval. Grace argued, her voice breaking, telling them Sophia called her mommy number 2, that she had raised her since birth, that love was more than a name on a certificate. Still the answer was no. Their eyes were sympathetic, but their hands were tied by law. When Michael found out what Grace had done, his reaction was not gratitude, but fear. He begged her to stop. He told her he could not bear to lose her as well, not after already losing his wife. His voice cracked as he said she was all Sophia had left. Grace listened, her heart torn, but deep down she knew he was wrong. This was not about fear. This was about courage. Sophia did not need her to stand still. Sophia needed her to fight. So Grace made another silent vow. She would not give up, not to the rules, not to fear, not even to Michael's desperate pleas. The child she loved like her own had asked if she would live, and Grace had no answer then. But now she did. She would fight until Sophia had more than just hope. She would fight until that little girl had life. Grace's decision was made in silence, but her heart thundered with every step. Dr. Rahman had promised help, and this was her only chance. She waited until Michael left for a business trip, then quietly packed a bag for Sophia and one for herself. She told the household staff they had a special consultation and tried to keep her voice steady, though her hands shook. At the hospital, she signed papers under false names. Each signature felt like crossing a line she could never return from. A nurse, sympathetic to her cause, helped arrange transport. But when Grace wheeled Sophia out through the side entrance, her pulse raced. Every glance from a passerby felt like suspicion. She whispered to Sophia to stay quiet, praying no one would ask questions. The airport was worse. Sophia, pale and exhausted, leaned against her shoulder as they approached security. Grace's throat went dry when the officer studied their passports. Her heart hammered as he flipped the pages slowly, glancing at her, then at the child in the wheelchair. For one long moment she thought the plan was over. Then, with a faint nod, he waved them through. Grace exhaled shakily, almost collapsing from relief. On the plane, she tucked a blanket around Sophia, watching her drift into a restless sleep. The hum of the engines could not quiet the storm inside her. If anyone discovered what she was doing, there would be questions, perhaps even consequences she could not control. Yet none of that mattered compared to the thought of losing Sophia. She closed her eyes and whispered, "We're going to make it, my love." When they finally arrived, Dr. Rahman's team met them in a quiet corner of the airport and moved them quickly to the hospital. The corridors smelled of antiseptic, the air heavy with urgency. Grace signed more papers, her hand trembling but firm. She knew she had crossed oceans and broken rules, but she had done it for one reason only. That night, as Sophia lay in bed, Grace sat beside her with a piece of paper and pen. Her heart pounded as she wrote each word. She slid the note under Sophia's pillow before dawn. "If I don't wake up, know that Mommy said yes." It was not a farewell. It was a promise carved from love, born of fear, and sealed with courage. The surgery stretched on for endless hours. In one room, Sophia lay surrounded by monitors, her small chest rising and falling with the rhythm of machines. In another, Grace's body was opened with care, as the surgeons removed a portion of her liver. Every move was precise, every second critical. By the time Michael's plane landed, both lives were hanging in the balance. He rushed through the hospital doors, his heart pounding as he demanded answers. The staff guided him to a quiet ward where two beds stood side by side. Sophia was pale but stable, her tiny hand wrapped in gauze. Grace was unconscious, her face drained of color, machines breathing for her. Michael stood frozen in the doorway, the sight carving into him more deeply than any loss he had ever known. A nurse placed a folded note into his hand. It was the letter Grace had written before the surgery. Michael sat heavily in the chair between the two beds, his hands shaking as he opened it. The words were simple. "If I don't wake up, know that Mommy said yes." At first he read them in silence. Then the weight of the truth crashed over him. His mind began to fill with memories. The first time Sophia had looked up at Grace with wide eyes and called her Mommy number 2. The laughter that filled the house on nights when Grace invented silly songs to make the child forget her fevers. The drawings taped to the refrigerator, always showing two women, one a mother she had never met and one who was standing right beside her. He remembered walking past Sophia's room late at night and seeing Grace bent over the bed, holding her hand through the pain. He remembered Sophia running to Grace after nightmares, finding safety in her arms. All those moments had been there for years, but he had been too blind, too focused on grief and business to see what they truly meant. The tears came hard, unstoppable. Michael pressed the letter to his chest, his shoulders shaking as the truth settled in. Grace had been a mother all along, not by blood, not by law, but in every way that mattered. Her sacrifice was only the final proof of a love that had already defined Sophia's life. For the first time, Michael bowed his head, not as a man of power, but as a father humbled by the courage of the woman who had stood by his child when he could not. Around him the machines hummed, softly, steady rhythms of survival. He held Sophia's hand in one palm, Grace's in the other. His tears fell freely, not from despair, but from the awe of witnessing what love could do. It was a miracle, not born from money or medicine, but from the heart of a woman who had chosen to say yes. The first signs of hope came when Sophia stirred in her hospital bed. Her eyelids fluttered open, and her weak voice broke the silence. "Daddy, where is Mommy number 2?" It was the only question she cared about. Michael held her hand, unable to speak, his throat tight with emotion. He told her softly that Grace was resting, that she was very tired, but still with them. Days passed with careful steps. Nurses checked Sophia's new liver every hour, and the doctors whispered about her remarkable progress. Yet the room remained heavy with waiting, until finally, on the 5th morning, Grace's eyes opened. She blinked slowly, confused at first, until she saw a small figure standing at her bedside. Sophia wore a paper crown from the children's ward and smiled so wide it lit the room. "Mommy number 2, I'm alive." Tears poured down Grace's face. She reached out with trembling arms as Sophia climbed onto the bed, hugging her tightly. It was not the machines or the medicine that made that room brighter. It was the reunion of two souls, bound not by blood but by choice. Around them, doctors and nurses paused, some brushing away their own tears. They knew they had witnessed something rare. The story spread quickly, carried first by whispers in the hospital halls, then by headlines and television screens. The world called it a miracle, a lesson that love could defy rules. People demanded answers about why laws had almost stopped Grace from saving Sophia. Debates opened, and one by one, hospitals began to rethink their policies. A caregiver's love was finally recognized as real. When reporters asked Grace for interviews and awards, she shook her head. She told them her reward was already here. Her little girl was alive, smiling, and dreaming again. That was all she ever wanted. She did not need fame. She only needed to see Sophia's laughter fill the air, proof that love, when lived with courage, could change not only a life, but the world. 1 year later, the Carter home no longer felt like a place of fear. Laughter bounced off the walls, and the garden bloomed with balloons and streamers. Sophia had turned 8, her cheeks full of color, her hair growing back in soft curls. She wore a yellow dress with a small crown, and her giggles filled the air like music. Guests clapped as she blew out the candles on a cake that seemed too big for such a small girl, but perfect for the moment. Grace stood right beside her, helping pour juice into cups and cutting cake into neat slices. Michael watched from the doorway with a camera in hand, his eyes shining with pride. The house that had once carried silence now overflowed with voices and joy. For the first time in years, it felt like a family was whole again. In the middle of the celebration, Sophia tugged on Grace's hand. Her voice lowered as she asked the question that had haunted them both. "Mommy number 2, am I really going to live now?" Grace knelt to meet her eyes, placed her hands gently on the child's shoulders, and smiled with tears in her eyes. "Yes, my love, you are going to live." The words were steady, carrying both promise and truth. The room around them blurred as the two embraced. Guests cheered, unaware of the weight carried in that simple exchange. Michael stopped filming for a moment, lowering the camera as his throat tightened. He no longer saw a servant and a child. He saw a bond that had survived the impossible, proof that love had rebuilt what loss once destroyed. On the living room wall, framed between family photos, hung the letter Grace had written before the surgery. Mommy said yes. Visitors often paused to read it, falling silent as they understood its meaning. It was more than paper. It was a declaration carved in sacrifice, a reminder that family is not written by blood, but by devotion. As the sun set, Sophia laughed with her friends, opening gifts and dancing without fear. Grace sat quietly on the couch, her heart at peace, knowing her choice had given this child more than life. It had given her a future. Michael stood beside them, his voice soft as he said that miracles are not found in wealth or science alone, but in love strong enough to face despair. The story ended not with fame or trophies, but with a home full of light. It carried one truth that would live forever. Motherhood does not need blood. It only needs a heart. And when love is strong enough, it can defeat sickness, silence, despair, and create life where the world had already written an ending. If this story touched your heart, please remember to like, share, and subscribe to Emotional Echoes, the place where true accounts and moving fiction come together to heal, uplift, and remind us of life's deepest values. Until next time, take care of yourself and keep your heart open. Don't forget to subscribe, Emotional Echoes, for more soul-stirring stories. Thanks for listening.